Hello, this is Unexplained America, and I'm your host, Lisa. And thank you so much for joining me this week. Now, this episode is the part two of the Abe Pipkins case. Go back and listen to part one if you have not listened yet. It is very involved, lots of information. So, I know we've been waiting on this episode, but a little business really quickly. So, please stop what you're doing right now and just take a second and please leave me a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, or leave me a comment, or do both. I really prefer both. Everything that you do helps the podcast. And also contact me with any content request. I love to get requests. I definitely line them up for future case files. So send me an email. It is unexplainedamerica2@gmail.com. So this week, again, we are talking about the Abe Pipkin case, and I had been kind of waiting to put this episode out because I really wanted to see if I could find the actual court transcripts on this file, and I could not, and we will get into that kind of later. Where I left you guys in part one was we had just discussed that Henry Lee Lucas had come forward in 1985, 1986 zone whenever he was confessing to tons of different murders across the country. He had come forward, they had approached him, and it turned out that he had absolutely no real evidence or information regarding Abe Pipkin's case. So, now, Abe's case, horrible death, happened in 1977. It's definitely cold, but it is very much being worked consistently by the Arkansas State Police. All throughout the 80s, there are still leads being followed. There is information, there are notes in the case file that clearly show that the family, Abe Pipkin's sons, specifically Joe and Guy, were discussing leads that they were hearing about with J.R. Howard, who was the investigator on the Abe Pipkin file, and they were really corresponding. They were looking at every single opportunity. And also, on top of following leads, JR, and he was a sergeant at this time, Sergeant J.R. Howard, so he was definitely trying to do everything he could to get Abe Pipkin's case out there. So he was corresponding and had been in contact, they had contacted him, Unsolved Mysteries. Now, I have not been able to locate that episode. If anybody has any information on that, please let me know. This correspondence was going on, and I can see that in 1990. So anything related to that on Unsolved Mysteries would have been after 1990. Also, the family does recall that there was a cold case episode that the family was definitely, again, trying to get all the information out there, and I could not locate that either. I did look up every single episode of cold case of the show Cold Case Files, but there are a lot of different shows out there, so if anybody can find that, I would love it. But I have looked everywhere. I've looked on YouTube. I've looked at every single episode that I can find on all my platforms. You guys know I like to watch stuff, so I'm on all the platforms: Prime, Hulu, Peacock, and all of that. So I looked at everything I could and just couldn't find an episode pertaining to Abe. With that being said, leads are being chased. People are still coming forward with information, although it is definitely slow and cold on Abe's case. But fortunately, in 1993, everything changes. On January 26th of 1993, at 10:15 a.m., there is an anonymous male caller that phones in to the chief of police in Beebe. Now, at that time, it is a chief named Harold Armstrong, so he's the new chief. Chief Armstrong, after speaking to this caller, he relays all the information to Sergeant J.R. Howard with the Arkansas State Police. The caller states his ex-wife, her name is Mitzi, she is working for actually the U.S. Forestry out of Mount Ida, Arkansas, and he states that she had an ex-boyfriend named Gary Lee Evans. Gary had shown up on Mitzi, and this is Mitzi conveying the story to her ex-husband. She states that Gary had shown up and had told her that he had beat an old night watchman when he was burglarizing a pharmacy in Beebe. He said Mitzi was very frightened of Gary, but thought perhaps she would talk now. Maybe there had been enough time, is what this caller was saying. He said he thought Gary lived in Jonesboro and worked for Sears, like the store Sears. This call comes in just out of nowhere on January 26th. And of course, this is a good lead. This is a big lead, and they need to figure this out. So, on March 31st of 1993, J.R. Howard, he goes to Montgomery County, gotten with the sheriff's office there, and they had set up a meeting with Mitzi could meet J.R. Howard. And as you all know, J.R. Howard was very instrumental in helping me with my Henry Lee Lucas episode, and he also gave me information about this case. And he stated to me whenever he showed up in Mount Ida that day, Mitzi just knew that someone wanted to talk to her, but she had no clue about what. So he states whenever she sees him, they're meeting face to face for the first time. He says that he's there to talk about, the Abe Pipkin case from 1977. He can see the blood drain out of her face and that her whole demeanor changes. And she was like, yeah, I knew that this day would come. So it was just very like a pivotal moment. And he definitely felt like Mitzi was the key to this situation right away. So on this Wednesday morning, March 31st of 1993, JR is able to interview Mitzi Pardon. And so she outlines in this interview quite a bit of information. So she states that when she was in 12th grade, which was the fall of 1975 into spring of 76, so her senior year, she got acquainted with Gary. He was a year older than she was, and she was associated with Gary up until 77, in 77. Now, she stated that she lived with him for about 3 months at one time during this period, and they lived in Fayetteville. Now, when she was first acquainted with Gary, he was a good guy, nice guy. He wasn't into drugs or anything, but he began to change, and he began using drugs, and then he began burglarizing drugstores. Gary would ask Mitzi to go along with him on these burglaries. And she states that she never went with him on any of the burglaries, like inside the store, but she did drive the car for him on 2 occasions. Gary would sell some of the drugs, and then he would use some of the drugs that he stole. She was also slightly using during this time, but never sold any drugs herself. As things progressed, Gary got worse. He began shooting up drugs, and she began pulling away from him during this period. So it was kind of like about 6 months into all this, and then she was like, no, thank you. She cut ties with Gary, and then she never had any more contact with him. Now, she states one morning before noon, and this was, she said, sometime in 77, Gary shows up unexpectedly at her mother's house, and this was in Jonesboro. Now, she said she was the only one there, and his first words were, I killed a man, or something to that effect. And she literally laughed and said there was no way. Like, she laughed it off, and he repeated it at least 3 times. And then he got very loud and forceful about it. And then she began to believe him in just the way that he was acting, and just the fact that he had shown up just on her doorstep. She said that he was acting extremely nervous, but was very clear in his speech and in his directness. She also said he was very hyper, and it could have been, in her words, due to being on speed, because that's kind of the way he usually was whenever he took speed. He did appear to feel very remorseful, but was very worried about getting caught. Gary went on to tell her that he and his cousin from Beebe had gone to a drugstore in Beebe and burglarized it. He said a policeman came up on them in the drugstore and recognized them. He said the policeman had to go find a phone to call this in, and Gary said that the guy literally was ignorant, because as soon as the policeman left him alone, he just took that time, he got a a crowbar or a tire tool and came up behind this police officer and hit him in the head with the crowbar. And Mitzi goes on to state in she knew personal knowledge of Gary that he always carried a crowbar whenever he was entering a drugstore. She went on to say the impression she got from Gary was that his cousin was sitting in the car and never got out of the car or was just on the sideline, like never went in to burglarize it, kind of the way that she would do whenever she went with Gary. She said she also got the impression that this wasn't a planned situation, but something that just happened. And the way Gary talked, he was only involved in the beating. Now, Gary indicated there was no traffic on the streets at the time. The area was not well lit. She kind of got the impression that they might have been in Gary's cousin's car, but that she didn't know that to a fact. He didn't really say. She said that Gary had an old station wagon with a lot of miles on it during that time frame. She said Gary said he came back to Jonesboro after the killing, but I'm not sure if his cousin was with him or stayed in Beebe. Now, she also stated that she didn't know if this event had happened that day or if it was 24 hours after the event. She had no idea. She said that Gary was at her house no more than 30 minutes. So it's like he showed up, said this, and then left. A few days after this happened, she heard about it on the radio. That at the time, she figured an H.W. Walker, who was a detective in Jonesboro, and this detective knew all about Gary's burglarizing. He had a history, and so she did not go to the police because she just assumed H.W. Walker would know about this and would put things together. And she was also very afraid of Gary because he knew things about her and she didn't want to get in trouble. So she's frightened of Gary. She was frightened of getting in trouble, and she, in her head, just thought this H.W. Walker detective would align the two, that this would be figured out. So this is what she signs off on March 31st. Of course, Officer Sergeant Howard asked Mitzi if she is willing to help them out by calling Gary, by doing some type of outreach to Gary to see if they can somehow record him confessing to Abe's death. Now, Mitzi advises in the file in 1993 that she will cooperate with any type of phone recording or wire recording of Gary. Now, I will say, at this time, Mitzi is a single mom. She has small children, and based on the information in the file, you can see that nothing more happens with Mitzi. And J.R. Howard himself did say that basically she got scared because of the situation that she was in. She was afraid that Gary would harm her or her children. And so nothing further happens with Mitzi at this time. So even before J.R. Howard met with Mitzi in March, so right after they got this information from the chief of police, Armstrong, they immediately start to track down and investigate Gary Lee Evans. So they travel to Craighead County in February, and they go to the sheriff's department and they get every file or anything pertaining to Gary Lee Evans from the sheriff's department. They also go to the Jonesboro Police Department and research all of their files. And so in this background of what they're doing, they're also having to track down Mitzi and set up that meeting. And then they were also trying to look and pull all of the latent prints that were found at Dotson's drugstore in 77 to compare them to any latent prints on file for Gary with the Craighead County Sheriff's Department and the Jonesboro. By April 1st, and of course this is after they've already met with Mitzi, an investigator, Dozier, has found out that Gary is no longer living in Jonesboro. So at this time, they find that he is residing in Little Rock on 36th Street in an apartment. Gary is living in this apartment with his brother Rick. at this time. And another investigator investigator Dale Sweezy, he is helping assist J.R. Howard and then investigator Dozier on this case. So he actually found that Gary had recently had a run-in with law enforcement there in Little Rock. Evidently, there was an incident where he allegedly assaulted an individual in a wheelchair. So all the investigators at this time are watching, surveilling a little bit this apartment situation where Gary is residing. And then they're still trying, based on Mitzi's information, they were actually at this point still thinking that she was going to talk to Evans for them, and they were trying to coordinate that meeting, like letting her know that he was in Little Rock and trying to set this up. And this was around April 6th. And all throughout April, the state police is working with Mitzi to try to coordinate some type of connection and timing that she could get in touch with Gary. Now, Mitzi let the investigators know that she would try to contact Evans around the first week in May. Also, in the meantime, the state police are trying to figure out who this cousin of Gary's could be. So they do locate a person in the Beebe area that has the same last name. And so they do look into it. So this rolls on into June and July. And by this time, Mitzi has kind of made it clear that she's not willing at this point in her life, because of her small children, because of her fear of Gary, to assist in setting up a conversation with Gary. The Arkansas State Police are very much still working this lead and trying to do everything they can without Mitzi's assistance at this point. Like I said, they had tracked down this person in Beebe, get confirmation that this person, and I'm not going to state their name just because they were never arrested or anything, but this person they do confirm is related to Gary. So they do confirm that. They do confirm where he works, and they're really trying to set up a meeting. In August, they do make contact with this cousin of Gary's. He has lawyered up. So they do set up an appointment with him and his lawyer for Wednesday, August 18th of 1993, just to discuss things with him. And they set this up, the Arkansas State Police are there, Chief of Police from Beebe, and also the White County Sheriff's Office. And at this point, the sheriff was a Jess Odom. Unfortunately, this meeting with Gary's cousin goes nowhere. Like I said, he had an attorney. You can't even tell in the file if they met or anything, but nothing transpires from that meet. Between the time that this happens in 1993, by the end of 1993, the state police, Sergeant JR, is hitting a brick wall. So in this time frame, by the year 2000, so 7 years later, they do have a computer system where they can actually upload the information about Abe's gun. So remember his .38 Special Smith & Wesson that was never located. They could finally enter this information into it like a national database, and so they do that. And they're working with the FBI in order to get certain things done, like the state police is working in conjunction with the FBI again. They get this uploaded, and there are 0 hits, because what they're looking for is to see if any crime in the country had this gun notated. And they have like the serial number from the gun. They had all the information from the gun uploaded. And this happened in the year 2000. Nothing hits on that, but at least the gun and everything is in the system. Now, obviously, J.R. Howard is still working this file. If other horrible crimes pop up in and out of this, 7-year span that he's having to give his attention to, at around about the time, kind of around the end of 2001, and then at the beginning of 2002, JR is just thinking, okay, it's been a minute. I really want to reach back out to Mitzi. Maybe now she is ready to assist us. He has one of his colleagues track down to find Mitzi. Okay, it's been several years, almost 10 years have passed now, and he has no idea where she lives or what she's up to. And so they do find that she is actually no longer living in Arkansas, but they do track her down. Okay, so they find her and he reaches out to her. When he phones her, she is just immediately helpful. She has been thinking about this, pondering on it. She is in just a very different situation. She is happily married. She is happily in church. She is feeling very convicted. Her kids are older, and her new husband is just a very, very nice man. He knows all about the situation, and he had been prompting Mitzi that it's time, like she needs to help the police out. So when JR calls her, this is just a sign from God that, okay, this is the time. This is what we need to do. After connecting again with Mitzi in 2002, JR has to get a setup. Okay, so Mitzi isn't even living in Arkansas. He has to figure out how is he going to get her here. He has figured out that Gary is remarried. He is back in Jonesboro, and he is working at the Sears store there. On Friday, March 26th of 2002, they have Mitzi wired up. They have her in Jonesboro. She's wearing a recording device, and at 10:30 a.m. on this Friday, she walks into the Sears department store, and this is located at this time at the Indian Mall in Jonesboro, Arkansas. She already knows. She has been prepped and outlined and talked to with the Arkansas State Police. So on that Friday morning of March 26th, Mitzi has the recording device on. There is an Officer Hoyt harness that is with her there in Jonesboro. And I will say, this transcript that we're going to get into is very long. This was a long ordeal, but Officer Harness outlines exactly where Mitzi needs to walk into the Sears store. She's standing there. I guess she sees Gary, and he's out there on the floor working, and she says, "Can I get some help with a tiller?" And Gary kind of immediately recognizes her. He says, "Sure, how can I help you?" And then he's like, "Mitzi?" And she's like, "Gary?" And then it's like, "How are you doing? You know, how are you?" They visit. He's like, "This is weird. It's so weird that, I mean, they haven't seen each other since 1977. Okay, and this is 2002. This is extremely weird." He comments, "Hey, this is weird." And she's like, "You work here?" "Yes, I've been working here." She asks him how long, how he's doing. He says, "Where are you living?" She tells him the state that she's living in. They go back and back. She says that she's working and that she's a biologist, and that she's a fishery. Actually, she's working for the federal government as a fisheries biology, and that she's in town to do a mussel survey. So that's what she tells him that she's doing. And he's like, "Oh, great. That's awesome." So he's going, they're just having a big conversation about this. And she's just saying, "Yeah, I'm working the St. Francis River bottom currently." So he's like, "I'm proud of you, blah, blah." And then he's saying, "Yeah, I'm just in management." He's updating her about where he's lived. He said that he's lived in Little Rock, he's lived in New Orleans, and she's like, "Oh, that's cool." And he's like, "I've got 2 kids, and one is 21, and then he's got a daughter that's 16 at the time." And she's like, "Oh, I've got a 16-year-old daughter." So they are basically bonding over all this. Outlined that their daughters are named the same thing, like their youngest are named the same thing. So it's like, oh, wow, that's really cool. So totally weird. They are having this whole conversation, and then she's talking. He says, "Okay, you're looking for a tiller." And she's like, "Yeah, I've got a Troy built, but I wanted to get my mom one." And evidently, like, she's talking about her mom still living in the area, still living in Jonesboro. Now, they talk about the tiller situation for a while, and basically they're catching up. She lets him know that most of her family is still in Jonesboro at the time. He's outlining where he lives there in Jonesboro. He states that he runs into her brother every now and again. Mitzi asks if he would like to get a Coke or something. He's like, "Sure." And she's like, "Can you take a break?" And he's like, "Yeah." She said, "You can just hop in with me. I've got a government vehicle." And he's like, "Oh, yeah." So they go out to her vehicle that they have there, and of course everything is wired up. Still talking about, still catching up. Just, it's a lot of chit chat about family and about mutual people that they knew. And then finally, and they are talking again. This transcript is, I don't even know how many pages long, probably 50 to 75 pages long of dialogue between Mitzi. I mean, she is doing an awesome job of getting Gary comfortable, of seemingly, she is just, I can't hear it, but I can see it. Like, she's just laid back. She's just talking, and they are talking about everything. And he, on his part, I will say again, I can't even hear it, but I can see it in the words and the language. It's just like, he is very much buttering her up. But they're talking about church and being remarried. He states that he's been remarried for 2 years. He talks about he no longer is doing drugs, like all of these things. And he is apologizing to her at some points for his behavior and just the drugs, but he is laying in on how good, quote unquote, he's doing, and kind of in a flirtatious way. It's a little, I don't know, maybe that's just me, but it's definitely that way. But he is outlining that he's remarried. His wife at the time is wanting to get into church, that she's very religious, and he states that at some point he just feels alienated about it. And then Mitzi is trying to like talk to him about how helpful it is for her to go to church and such. And he makes the statement, I think about the things that I did and the terrible person I was, how much I've changed. I've really changed a whole lot. You probably wouldn't even know. And then she's like, really? Yeah, I'm a lot different. You feel different? Well, I'm different. And she says, yeah. And then he says, well, I've made more peace with myself even without going to church. I'm at more peace with my kids, and I don't know what or how, what had happened or when it changed, but I just cringe when I think about the past and things that I did, robbing drugstores, and it just makes me cringe, Mitzi. And she says, I know, I remember when you came over that morning. So she kind of gets her opening. You told me that you had to, or you had robbed that drugstore and that you hit that guy to get away. And I thought, and she's telling him, I thought that he can't be telling the truth. And then like 2 weeks later, Gary, I heard on the news that the guy died. And Gary just says, to that remark. Mitzi says, what happened? And he says, do you really want to know? And she says, yeah, I do, because ever since then, it's been like, I couldn't believe that you did that. I mean, because we did it, because she says, because we did it in a tree that time. And then he said, you're going to make me laugh and cry at the same time. So yeah, I'd like to know, and then he says, I didn't know that. I didn't remember that I told you. So he basically is saying, I didn't even remember telling you. She said, yeah, you did. I remember. I mean, I've always kept it like back here and not said anything because I don't want to think about it, because I was underneath the Bono Bridge listening to the radio, and it came on the radio that the guy died. And I was like, oh my God, that's the guy that Gary was talking about in Beebe. Wasn't it Beebe or something? And Gary says, yeah. And you were with your cousin and he? And he said, no, not my cousin. Well, I could go to jail for it. Yeah, there's no doubt. And she says, well, you couldn't now. I mean, he said, oh yeah, there's no statute of limitations on that. Oh, you don't think it bothers me? Yeah, I'm sure. And she states, yeah, I'm sure. I was really, that's why I've been thinking about, how you, and then she cuts off there. Gary said, there's no way you can. How can you take that back? And she says, you can't. And Gary says, he's not going to come back. There's not hardly a time I don't pass by there and I don't cry. And she said, pass by what? And he said, that town. And she states, so why? I mean, what are you? I mean, you don't remember coming by and talking to me? And he says, no, I don't remember telling you. And she said, are you serious? And he said, yeah, I'm serious. And she said, ever since then, Gary, I'm not kidding you, I can't watch a scary movie. And he says, really? And she says, yeah, because I think I know somebody who, I mean, I know you wouldn't have meant to do it. And he said, oh no. And she says, so what happened, and he said, I've just blocked it out of my mind so much. You never go to the police and tell on me, would you? And she says, oh yeah, right. And he says, you wouldn't, would you? And she said, no. I mean, Gary, if I was going to do that, then I would have done it. And he states, I know it. And she states, when they could have gotten something on you. And he says, no, they probably couldn't prove it now. And she said, no, I mean, they would have to come up with fingerprints, and they would have already have gotten you if they were going to get you. And he states, Mitzi, you know the violence, and I just can't believe I did it either. He pulled a gun on me and I hit him with a crowbar. And she says, are you serious? And he said, yeah, and I guess I killed him. And she states, I remember you said he was old. And Gary says, yeah. And she says, I thought you said he recognized you. That or he recognized your cousin or something. And Gary says, no, I don't remember that. He saw my face. And she said, oh, that's probably what you meant, that he could recognize you later or something. And Gary says, yeah, no, there's no way you can. I guess I'll get paid back in a later life. I've been paid back in this life enough. I don't know how I've overdosed 3 or 4 times. I don't know how I lived. And so they continue to talk, taking care of his children. He says, the only thing I can say that I'm alive for is my children. Does also go on to say that he has a great wife now. She is amazing. J.R. Howard told me himself that, Mitzi did such an amazing job, that she did better than any actress that he could think of, better than Julia Roberts. She just did an amazing job. They go get cherry limeades from the Sonic. They're talking. They go to the Sonic. They get the drinks. And then she goes and drops Gary off. And literally, as soon as Gary is out of the car, she says into the recorder. So this is her statements. Of course, she's talking to the investigator. She said, holy shit, I think we got him to say what y'all wanted. I'm sure we got him to say what y'all wanted. She is just, you can imagine how she's feeling. And I sure as hell, he did not put the two together, because he was in here and I forgot it was on. I don't think he will, because we talked about a bunch of other stuff. And I know you don't want me talking, but I'm going to talk anyway. Go, woman, go. She was, I guess she's talking to people on the road. She said, man, that was nerve wracking. I want a beer. Y'all taking me out for a beer? I hope so. Is it late enough? I think so. He said it though. He said it. Poor guy pulled a pistol on him and he hit him with a freaking crowbar. Couldn't get him to say who he was, but he did say that. I didn't really want him to say who he was with, because that would be that would just be too much, because he has only told who. Me and his ex-wife, he said. Why did he tell me? Oh, Hoyt, you're right. It was inaudible. Oh, man. And he started crying. So Gary was crying on her. I said, I was about to die. Oh, gosh. I did the right thing, though, right? I did the right thing. Did y'all hear? He robbed like how many drugstores for that one guy? He's done some time, but he's gotten away with a lot of shit. Oh, yeah, I did what y'all wanted me to do. Yes. Are y'all able to hear me? Y'all aren't able to hear me. Why am I talking to y'all? I did it though. I got it. God, this video camera better work. I'll be really pissed off if this stuff didn't work. Sure it would. Why am I saying that? Wait, I know I'm not supposed to be talking, but it's like, her and Green. So she's talking while she's driving, and that's where the tape ends. So she meets back up with the investigators. This all goes down March 26th of 2002. Immediately, the Arkansas State Police knew they had Gary, but they still had work to do. So right after this, they begin pulling everything they can documentation-wise. On April 29th of 2002, they get in contact with the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. They do confirm in that a conversation with them that Gary was never a student. Now, at the same time, they contact and get all of the records from the Fayetteville Police Department during the 1970s. The Fayetteville Police Department send their file of information on Gary. Now, what it reflects is that on April 8th of 1979, Gary is arrested for burglarizing a Collins drugstore east. He is with another person. There is a woman, and we'll get into that. But when he is arrested, basically he doesn't make any statements. He lawyers up, but he does state and confesses to the fact that he was the one that burglarized Collier's Drug East 3 times in 1977. The dates on that were March 26th of 77, April 1st of 77, and then April 24th. They get that information. In this statement to police, Gary gives all of his quote-unquote information, okay? So he is giving the police a good rundown of information. Like I said, he wasn't alone. He did have a woman with him that was also arrested. Now, when he is arrested, he does tell the police that he was a student at the University of Arkansas. And again, the police have confirmed that no, he was never a student, but he does tell them that he was a student. He does also say that he did complete 2 years of college at the ASU Jonesboro, which is where he was from, although he was born in Little Rock. He does state that his birthday is June 19th of 1956, and at the time in 1979 he was 22, so making his age only 20 years old in 77. Now at this time he does reflect that he has needle marks on both arms. He admits that he is a quote-unquote junkie. He is described as a white male, 5'8", 150 pounds, brown hair and brown eyes, with fair complexion, and he is right-handed. Now, he says that he is single. He outlines his parents, who live in Jonesboro. He does say he has one brother. His vehicle is a 1967 VW Bug, and it is white. And like I said, he is arrested with a woman. Now, her name is Bonnie. I'm not going to get into all the particulars, but at the time that she is arrested, she is sitting in a car right there at the Collier's drugstore where Gary was arrested. Okay, now, she states when they arrest her, this is kind of funny, that she has no clue as to who Gary Evans is. However, when she is arrested, she is given her one phone call, and she calls the number, and they write down the phone number, which is Gary's father's phone number. Okay, and she had just told the police that she had no clue who Gary was. The vehicle that she is driving, I guess is kind of the getaway car, quote unquote, is a 1978 Toyota. Now, she is only 19 years old, poor girl, and she is running around with, this self-proclaimed junkie, and she is sitting in this getaway car here in Fayetteville in 1979, and he does lawyer up, but he does relay to the police that he had been arrested. He said he did not have any quote-unquote convictions at this time in 1979. He is arrested. It looks like he had stolen about $778 worth of drugs from Collier's drugstore on this 1979. The police were driving around kind of the downtown area of Fayetteville where this drugstore was, and this was located on Highway 16 in Fayetteville. The alarm system on the store went off, which alerted the police. So basically, Gary had broken a front window. He had knocked out the glass. It set off the alarm that probably they got after their store was broken into so much in 1979, okay, or in 1977. Now, I cannot tell at this point if Gary ever served any time heard for this crime. So we had already mentioned that the Arkansas State Police had been pulling records and getting all the documentation on Gary from Jonesboro. So this was back whenever Mitzi had first come forward in 1993. But they do have documentation from the Jonesboro Police Department that on December 27th of 1976, and so this would have been before those burglaries in Fayetteville and even before Abe was killed, okay, Gary was arrested for a possession of having a controlled substance. And this was, again, in Jonesboro. He states his occupation at that time was a student. He shows at this time that he had no arrest record. And at that time, he showed that he was driving a 1965 Plymouth. Now, the records also showed that Gary is charged with criminal mischief in the second degree, and this happened on October 22nd of 1979. So basically, he was arrested in Fayetteville in April. So I'm guessing nothing really happened with that arrest. So now he is arrested and actually tried by the city of Jonesboro for a burglary. It says that he recklessly broke out a plate glass window at Lee's Pharmacy, which was located on Southwest Drive in Jonesboro. Now, he stole pharmaceutical drugs valued at less than $1,000. Now, at this time, it does show that he is with a woman named Vicky, who we discussed, who would be later wife and mother of his children, by the way. Also, in this documentation, now he is also arrested in 1980 and then again in 1985. So it looks like he kind of had possibly a break, or maybe there were other counties just not known, or he was definitely maybe burglarizing and was never caught or looked at, or maybe he was just going out of that spectrum. He is arrested in 1980, and then he is arrested and actually convicted through a trial from his arrest in 1985. Now, in 1985, it is described that he used a crowbar to break out the front glass of a Horton's drugstore. Sound familiar, doesn't it? He is convicted. This happened in Poinsett County. He is convicted. He serves, and he does, like, right away go through a 60-day drug treatment program. I want to say by literally April of 1986. So, and he was given a 5-year sentence, by the way. Within a few months of going through this treatment program, he is already requesting to an early parole so that he can work. So he is married. He's married to that Vicky person. It looks like she is pregnant and everything. So they go through this process, and basically, because he is looked at as a quote unquote non-violent offender, he is able to get letters of recommendation. So basically, he's working for a company called Crown Convenience. Well, they write a letter to the parole board, and they state that if Gary is paroled, he will definitely have a job. They don't know exactly where it would be because they have convenience stores, but he would be a store manager somewhere. They also get with the chief of police of Harrisburg where the Horton's drugstore was located, and they do confirm with the chief of police, and he writes a whole letter that states, if you decide to parole Gary, that is fine with me. I don't have a problem. I don't mind if he lives and works here. Evidently, Vicky, the wife, is already residing here, and they're about to have a baby. So basically, everything's just kind of forgiven, okay, by the chief of police, by the town, whatever. Okay. So he is granted early release. And like I said, he does go through this 60-day treatment program. Now, it looks like, kind of going a little bit backwards, whenever he was arrested in 1980, they did look at him for several different burglaries involving either doctor's offices or pharmacies. Now, they looked at him for burglaries, and this is 4 different burglaries of a Dr. William R. Garrison's dental office. So this office was broken in 4 different times between 1976 and 1979, so 4 different occasions. They look at him for a burglary of the Craighead Memorial Hospital pharmacy in 1977. They look at him for 4 different occasions of that Lee's drugstore between 76 and 78. And of course, we do know that he is actually charged for an October of 1979 burglary of Lee's pharmacy. Okay. Now, there was also 3 different times that a Dr. Hermie Plunk was burglarized, like his doctor's office. He was in Jonesboro. And then there were 5 different times in 1979 where a Plaza Pharmacy Inc. was burglarized, and this is also in Jonesboro. And then there was 1 occasion of a Barry's Wood Springs Road pharmacy that was burglarized. So they're looking at him for all of these different burglary occasions, and of course, we've discussed the ones that he was actually arrested for. Unfortunately, he wasn't actually tried for until you get to the 1985 burglary of the Horton's drugstore. Now, we talked about 1980. Gary is investigated in 1980. He's kind of a prime suspect in a burglary. Now, the burglary happened between March 1st and March 2nd of 1980, sometime between this time frame, and the location was an Arkansas Children's Colony. Now, this Arkansas Children's Colony, a facility that catered to mentally handicapped children, and they did have doctor's office, they have medicines in this facility. Well, Gary's mother worked at this facility, yes, and she had keys to the facility. So after this place is burglarized, and we're talking about a large quantity of pharmaceutical drugs are taken, Gary kind of becomes the primary suspect, and he is very much looked into. There is a gentleman that comes forward that is interviewed by the police that states that Gary came to his house, wanted him to hold a large amount of drugs that Gary, quote unquote, stated that he had stolen from the Arkansas Children's Colony, and that he had a key and he had broken in utilizing the key. Gary is arrested on this charge, and he is given in November a 10-year suspended sentence in order to pay $1,000 fine in restitution to the children's colony. So he doesn't even spend time for this offense. Now, the police are also checking on Gary's work history and then his student history. So they do reach out to the Arkansas State University to actually get Gary's dates of attendance so they can kind of see when he is enrolled in school. So it does look like he was enrolled in the fall of 1974, the spring of 1975, then again in the fall of 75, the spring of 76, but then he is not enrolled in the fall of 76, but he is enrolled in 77. And we know that that's when he was running around Fayetteville burglarizing. And we know that he self-proclaimed that he burglarized and killed Abe Pipkin, or burglarized Dotson's pharmacy in April of 77. But he was, quote unquote, enrolled in those time frames. And then it does show after that he is in a summer session in 78. So that was June and July of 78. And then he is in a spring session of 1980. And that was the entire length of the time that he was enrolled, quote unquote, Arkansas State University there in Jonesboro. So the state police are working in conjunction with the White County Sheriff's Office to procure an arrest warrant for Gary Lee Evans. And of course, they've been documenting their file by getting all of the records that they can on Gary. Now, by Friday, July 12th of 2002, at 7:45 a.m., 46-year-old Gary Lee Evans is arrested in the parking lot of Indian Mall in Jonesboro. Now, he was headed into work that morning. He is the retail manager at that Sears store that Mitzi ran into him, quote unquote, and had the conversation that sealed this arrest. The Arkansas State Police, in conjunction again with the White County Sheriff's Office, they take Gary into custody and they do bring him to the jail where he is entered into the White County Detention Center, and he is held there without bond on the capital murder charge of the 1977 killing of Abe Pipkin. Gary, via his attorney, he immediately gets attorney, which his name is David Reese of Jonesboro. They enter a plea of not guilty. And immediately, Gary is stating that he has no clue what this is about, that this is coming out of left field, completely blindsided by this. In fact, the newspapers will share on the Tuesday after that the headline is Evans denies killing officer. In another article, his wife, which at the time in 2002, Gary is married to a woman named Dana. Now, she is stated that she had kissed Gary goodbye that morning and that she was completely blindsided, had no clue that anything like this would happen. Now, David Reese also cites that Gary had, quote unquote, put himself through college and did not represent harm to the community as far as in his argument for bail. Now, ultimately, Gary is not given any type of bail, and he remains in the detention center until his trial is ready in February of 2003. Now, just a little side note, little tidbit on this. So, I do have a friend that her husband was in school at ASU Jonesboro in this time frame that Gary is, living in Jonesboro, working at the Sears, and arrested. So he is actually under he's actually working for Gary, like in the kind of like the warehouse or delivery portion of the Sears. And so he recalls just saying what a complete jerk Gary was. And, once he found out that he was arrested, because of course that was just super shocking gossip going around the store, like, hey, Gary got arrested this morning. It was obviously a surprise to people, but Gary was definitely not a very nice person, not a very nice person to work under, according to my friend's husband that did work under him. So just a little tidbit. I thought that was interesting. Now, obviously, Gary's family is absolutely shocked. This was a shock to his wife. He has two children, one of which is a 16-year-old daughter that is living with him there in Jonesboro. However, for Abe's family and the Beebe community, this is absolutely wonderful news. Finally, some kind of justice, some kind of peace, and actual rest. And this is after 25 years of just questions, and of course, the whole community this whole time is pointing fingers and wanting answers. And finally, the arrest of Gary is a wonderful, elated event for Abe and the community. So after Gary is arrested, the investigation doesn't stop there. The police, the state police, they bring in around 50 different individuals, knew Gary through being either a fraternity brother. He was in a fraternity when he was in Jonesboro at times. He hung out at the fraternity house, although he was not really an active member, but he was in the Lambda Chi fraternity. They spoke to and interviewed all these people. Remember, in the file, we're talking part one, go back. So remember when I mentioned that there was an DEA informant that had mentioned, and this was in April of 1977, that mentioned the names Gary Evans and Billy. Now, he mentioned that both of these people were from Jonesboro, and this informant mentioned that they might have had something to do with this situation. And they also mentioned the Terry person. Billy is interviewed and gives an extensive story about how he was out of town whenever Gary robbed the pharmacy in Beebe, killed Abe. So he gives a whole thing. He gives a polygraph. The polygraph is kind of conclusive, but there's nothing substantial that the police can link to Billy. They speak to a lot of other people because there are other frat brothers that mention that perhaps that a Jason person was with Gary at the time that he robbed the store. And I will say, Billy did concede that he had been the driver on other burglaries with Gary. Like there was one kind of around that situation, Gary killed Abe, where Billy was with him in a Newport pharmacy burglary. So he was conceding that he was definitely with him at some, but he was never in Beebe. This Jason person that was also linked through some other interviews, he states that he was never around Gary, that he never ran around with Gary. He knew that Gary was wild and he stayed away from him. He was one of the fraternity people in the house. The police do interview Vicky. So Vicky, which was Gary's ex-wife that he had the children with, Vicky states to the police that Gary, one time she came home, Gary was crying, and that he told her that he did kill a man, but she didn't know any information. She didn't know who it was, that it was a police officer. She thought that he had shot a man during one of his pharmacy burglaries, but she didn't know anything more than that. But there was another woman who Gary actually lived with for a period of time, and her name is Lucinda. She went by Cindy. This Cindy is able to tell the police Gary did tell her about the incident with Abe and that he was burglarizing. So he tells her the whole situation just like he had told Mitzi, whom he didn't even realize he told, but he does let Cindy know that he, in a burglary situation, he quote unquote accidentally killed a man. And he does tell her some details. She tells the police that he mentions the name Billy that was with him. Again, the police talk to Billy. They can't pin Billy to him. In fact, if you remember, Mitzi thinks that she understood that his cousin was with him. So obviously, nobody is pinned down to actually being with Gary at the time that he killed Abe, but there were definitely signs that he normally had people with him. So that is interesting in itself. Cindy will also go on to actually testify at the trial. So you have Mitzi's testimony, you have Vicky's testimony, you have Cindy's testimony, you have more than just the recording, Gary himself saying it. So there's quite a bit of statements made about this. So he definitely wasn't quiet about what he did. So this was further evidence to back up Gary's own words and Mitzi's words. Gary's trial, and like I said, he is held without bail in the White County Detention Center. The trial is being held in Searcy, Arkansas, my hometown, which is county seat of White County. Gary's trial begins on Monday, February 10th. Of 2003. The judge is named Robert Edwards. The prosecutors for the county are a Cynthia Baker and a Chris Raff. The jury that is seated consists of 7 women and 5 men with 2 alternates. Now, the prosecution, so basically they seat that jury and the prosecution opens that same Monday. And they do call the Arkansas State Police investigators that worked the file. They do not actually call J.R. Howard, but they do call the other investigators that did work the file. Also call Mitzi. A woman named Lucinda was called as well. They also call the former chief of police, Bradley, and then they call the present chief of police. So they call Harold Bradley, so they call Bradley and Jackson there. Prosecutors also call the state medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Marks, and a few acquaintances of Gary's from college in the 1970s. Dr. Marks would describe Abe's brutal death, and he does describe that Abe received strikes to the head. Again, there were 12 to 14 strikes to the head that were blunt force trauma, and that these head injuries alone were fatal strikes. Jury does get to listen and see. So they listen to the tape recordings between Mitzi and Gary. They also get to see the transcript, just like I have, just like we went over, but they also get an outline of Gary's rap sheet and documentation of all the multiple burglaries of the pharmacies and such. So they are getting a full look at Gary's history and his obvious how he did things. He carried around the crowbar, he broke the glass. In Abe Pipkin's case, Abe was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Gary brutally attacked him in order to get away. By Wednesday of this week, so the trial starts on Monday, by Wednesday, prosecution rests, and the defense, they call some witnesses. In fact, they do call J.R. Howard. J.R. does outline kind of a funny instance. So in a situation that is definitely not funny, of course, this was extremely hard for Abe's family to sit through, of course. And, Abe's family consisted of his sons, and he had a daughter, but this was just a very hard ordeal. And in fact, I'll kind of get into it. One of Abe's granddaughters was able to come to the trial as well and just described how hard that was for the family. But J.R. Howard was able to state that the defense called JR to testify. Okay, so the prosecution, they didn't really want to get first stab at JR. They kind of wanted to be able to cross-examine JR. So that's why they were fine with the defense calling JR instead of them calling JR. Now, on the stand, this happened in 1977. So he had notes. He had brought himself notes. He needed to brush up on facts and such. So he had his notes, but he also had his grocery list. During his testimony with the defense, the attorney, David Reese, actually took JR's notes. He said, "Can I see those notes?" So he takes them, and before JR gets off the witness stand, he's like, "Hey," and this is, in a packed courtroom, of course, judge and attorneys, and he's like, "Hey, can I have my notes back? Like, that has my grocery list. Like, I like, I need that." So just kind of definitely a moment of just definitely a situation that was definitely not funny and very heavy situation. The defense, what the prosecution has, is a literal, what we would call direct evidence. So I've kind of gotten into this before. When they talk about circumstantial evidence, they are talking about fingerprints, DNA, things like that. That is all circumstantial. The only thing that is actual direct evidence would be if there was some type of audio or video recording of someone doing the crime, okay? Or the person stating that they did the crime, or recording, in this case, of them stating that they committed the crime. Either it's got to be some type of documentation directly from the event happening or the person that did it stating that, okay? I think I've seen also if you had a witness to the crime and they're stating what they saw, okay, like a direct witness. That is the only direct witness. So in this case, they actually did not have a lot of circumstantial evidence. They really didn't. They didn't, we talked about the evidence that was collected. There wasn't any quote unquote DNA at this time. They did have fingerprints, okay? Well, there were all kinds of, this is a pharmacy. There are all kinds of fingerprints. Latent prints never matched up with anything. So the defense is saying, in their defense, they're saying, hey, there is zero physical evidence, no circumstantial evidence. The attorney states that Mitzi failed to come forward for 2 decades, and then the defense states that the only reason that she came forward was because she's angry, and it's in retaliation because Gary gave her hepatitis in the 70s when they dated. This is what the defense is saying. Also, the defense is stating that Evans couldn't have murdered Abe because at this time he was in Fayetteville dealing with a drug overdose, which they could never actually document, like being in a hospital or being in Fayetteville. There was no documentation to support that claim by the defense. It's not like they show proof of that. Ultimately, by Thursday, the defense rests. Now, Friday, both sides have closing arguments, and the jury deliberates for a couple hours, and they come back with a guilty verdict, and they sentence Gary to 30 years in prison. Okay, now I will state, they do ask a question of the judge. Okay, the jury, before they give this, and this all happens like into late Friday, okay? All of this happens Friday. They had asked the judge about how parole works because they were looking at a sentence of 60 years. Okay, that would have been like the maximum. I think the prosecution was asking for 60 years. Well, the judge states to the jury that he cannot discuss to them parole matters in anything pertaining to how parole works or anything like that. Okay, he can't dictate to the jury how long Gary's actually going to serve if he gets this 30-year sentence at this time in 2003. They do come back, the jury comes back with a 30-year sentence. This happens on Valentine's Day. So they come back. It is February 14th of 2003. Abe's family holding hands. They're holding on to each other while this jury deliberated. And upon hearing this guilty verdict, they are absolutely elated. They can finally breathe. Obviously, this doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring Abe back, but they finally have justice for Abe. They are finally able to breathe. And Gary makes zero sounds and has zero facial expressions. It looks like he looks down during the trial, kind of grimaces, but nothing more. And of course, he is still, even with the admission on the audio, is still saying that he had nothing to do with this murder of Abe. When the verdict was read, Gary's wife, Dana, placed her head in her hands and cried, but Gary remained emotionless. Now, he had cried during certain statements during trial. On top of the defense statements, one of the things that the Gary's attorney stated, and one of the reasons why he wanted to call J.R. Howard, was because he wanted to point out that there were other people, aka like Henry Lee Lucas, so to speak, that did come forward as suspects or stated that they had participated in Abe Pipkin's death. But of course, that wasn't true. Nothing panned out. But that was part of the defense. It was pointing out that the police had targeted other parties for the crime. So Gary Lee Evans, in the meantime, after his sentencing, he is placed in prison. His team, his attorney, is stating that he is going to file for an appeal and that justice was not done. However, the Arkansas State Police, the Sheriff's Office, Abe's family is very confident that justice was done and they're very happy. However, Abe Pipkin's family would continue to have tragedy. On Monday, August 4th of 2011, the unthinkable happens to Abe's family. Now, Billy Joe Pipkin was Abe's son. He went by Joe, by the way. He owned a pawn shop right there off the highway in Cabot, Arkansas. He had actually owned this pawn shop for 25 years. Joe was just one of those entrepreneurial guys that just did great and fabulous at business, and he had met a friend that had a pawn business and just had gotten into it. And before, Joe had owned numerous business. He had sold and purchased cars. He had a car lot. He owned investment properties. He was a wheeler and dealer and just very good at business. Now, Joe at this time was 61 years old. He has his wife. He has his kiddos. In fact, he has a grown daughter named Billy who had been by his side during the trial for his father in 2003. Now, Billy was extremely close to her father, and in fact, at this time, her husband, JD, was actually working with her dad at the pawn shop. Now, on this Monday, JD had been working. He had eventually gone out from the store, leaving Joe there on his own, which was not unusual for him to be in the store by himself. And Joe was very, very, I will say, he was successful, a clean cut man, but he also knew how to take care of himself. Like, he had guns there in the shop. He owned this pawn shop. Now, he was a very fair man. He was a very giving man, but he knew how to take care of himself. Now, this pawn shop was very close to several other businesses. Okay, this was close to a business called Precision. Joe's business, named KPC Pawn, was very close to where he and his wife Julie lived. So this was all kind of there off of the highway there in Cabot. On the afternoon of the 4th of April, there were some workers there at Precision, and they see that Joe's pawn shop is on fire. So they immediately call for the fire department, but they also run up to Joe's house and they go get Julie. Okay, so right away they're trying to figure this out. This is shocking. This situation is like, what's going on? Okay, this is horrible. So the fire department, they get there and they go into the pawn shop and find that Joe is in the pawn shop and that he has been shot. So they call for backup, and this is just devastating. Billy, her sisters, their family, they are just absolutely devastated. Joe meant the world to his daughters, his wife, his family. This was absolutely devastating. Of course, this literally is happening almost 34 years to the day that Abe was killed. And this is a horrible deja vu or something horrible for the family. Like, they don't know what to think. Is this connected? Billy will tell me, just FYI, Billy was kind enough to reach out to me whenever I put out the first part of Abe Pipkin case. And so I was fortunate to get to talk to her and visit with her about the events of all of this and such. And she's a wonderful woman and part of this wonderful family. But Billy told me, like, she immediately calls J.R. Howard because, of course, their whole family was incredibly close to J.R. One of the first things that they wanted to know was, is this connected? Did Gary Lee Evans somehow have this done from prison? What's going on? Like, how can this be happening to our family? This happens on August 4th. The police, in fact, the ATF is called in. So you have the Lonoke County Sheriff's Office on this. You have the Cabot Police Department. They call in the Arkansas State Police to investigate, and then they call in the ATF to investigate. So they have all hands on deck as far as this investigation. And literally by Thursday the 7th, they have arrested 2 individuals. So they arrest a 37-year-old David Dareberry and his wife Jacqueline. She is 31 years old. They are from Greenbrier. They have 4 children. The investigation led them to the Dareberries, and literally they are arrested. They are taken in. David is saying that his wife Jacqueline is innocent, and literally by the 9th, David has fully confessed to shooting Joe's pawn shop, and he states that it was purely greed. He purely wanted money, so he went in. In fact, David was a regular customer there at the pawn shop. Like, Joe knew him. He had been kind of in and out of the store, and really kind of in hindsight, he was casing the place, kind of waiting for Joe to be alone. David had gone in. He states that things got out of control and that he didn't mean to shoot Joe, but he does shoot Joe. So on April 9th, David confesses. He states that his wife Jacqueline is totally innocent. David is arrested for capital murder, but Jacqueline is not. She is arrested for criminal use of property, felony theft by receiving, and then hindering apprehension of prosecution. So she is arrested. David is arrested. Again, he pleads guilty, and then lo and behold, Jacqueline, who has the lesser charges, she pleads guilty as well. Now, because they plead guilty, this case does not go to trial and obviously is not connected at all to Abe's case, but just horrific. Like, nobody could even make this up or even dream that this would happen to this family. What an awful ordeal. And again, these people, it turns out that the property stolen was literally only combined maybe $1,000 worth of items that they actually got away with. Okay, so things that David got away with. But he goes in there, shoots Joe, he leaves Joe, and sets the place on fire. David is sentenced to a life sentence without parole. Jacqueline, she pleads the guilty and she receives a 20-year sentence. I cannot see exactly when she was paroled, but she was paroled because she is not in the inmate system. David is in the system, and he is at the Cummins unit here in Arkansas, where he will remain for the end of his life. I will say his picture he looks very much older than his actual age. And it looks like in 2023, Jacqueline actually filed for divorce from David. So they remained married from 2011 to 2023. And I guess she decided at that point to file divorce. A horrible, horrible tragedy again in the Pipkin family. You know, Joe was only 61 years old. He was beloved. His family misses him deeply. He was loved by his community, his neighbors. This was a shocking event just all the way around. And of course, the family's like, how could this happen? Absolutely, how could this happen? Billy still just recalls just wonderful memories of her father, like when she was in high school. You know, he had a car lot. And so, you know, he offered to get her a car, and she was like, nah, I'll just drive whatever you've got. So she told me, you know, there were times when she would literally go to school in the morning and then in the afternoon, she might have a different vehicle waiting for her. Like, her dad would just leave a car because he would sell the car that she was driving, and he would leave her a car with the keys, you know, under the car seat or whatever in the mat, you know, just there. So, you know, she was a daddy's girl. He was very important to her. It's just an absolutely devastating situation. And again, just like in Abe's case, it was senseless tragedy for greed, but the greed amounted to less than $1,000. Like, oh my goodness, like, it makes absolutely no sense to me. So this horrible event, it happens in 2011. Now, kind of fast forward to 2014. At this point, Gary Lee Evans, you know, he's been in jail. He's also been in that Cummins unit from what I could see. And he files for parole. And he is actually granted parole in December of 2014. So he is literally serving 11 years of that 30-year sentence. Okay. Obviously, this is 2014. Joe is gone now. It's just a devastating situation to the family because, you know, at least Joe's murderer is going to be held in custody for the rest of his life, but definitely not Abe Pipkin. So Gary Lee Evans, he got away with this murder of Abe, this senseless act. He gets away with it. He walks free, lives his life for 25 years, and then after being sentenced on a capital murder charge, he gets sentenced to 30 years and serves 11. So he is a free man as of end of 2014. From what I can see, and obviously this devastated the Pipkin family whenever they found out that he was going to get parole. They were just absolutely devastated. One relative of the family states, I just want people to know that the Pipkin family has suffered enough. Each year since 2009, Gary Lee Evans asked for parole, and each time the family testified to prevent him from getting out. But year after year, you know, this kept popping up, and now he is out, and it's a shock to the family. Obviously, I wanted to look up and see if I could see any criminal activity on Evans since 2014. Gary Evans has had a traffic issue. He was driving without insurance, but in 2023, he was arrested for terroristic threatening of an ex-wife. Now, she was allowing him to live with her. He was evidently in not great health, and they got into a fight, and she called the police on him, and he stated that he had threatened to kill her, and that she also stated that he murdered Abe Pipkin in 1977. So she was very scared. She's like, this guy has actually murdered someone before. In 2025, it looks like Evans was involved in a lawsuit protection order with someone that he's related to, and this was actually filed by him. So he got a protection order against a relative in 2025. As you can see, Gary is out. He is living his life without any type of remorse for his actions. It was more of a remorse of being caught. Just an absolute travesty. Whenever I was kind of waiting to put out this episode, because what I really wanted to look at was the actual court transcripts. I wanted to see the court transcripts. Well, I did speak to a court reporter. So back in 2003, there was a different court reporter, and evidently they are the only ones that are keeping up with the transcript. Okay. And this court reporter handled Gary's trial. She had moved. So a different court reporter, I was sent to talk to a different court reporter, and we were just talking about how this went down and the parole situation. And obviously this is, he only served a third of a sentence. She had mentioned that kind of since 2003, when you have such a serious case like this, like a capital murder, like a first degree murder trial here, the rules are more like a 70-30, but more like you're going to serve the 70% of your sentence instead of just your 30%. And obviously at this time, Gary Lee Evans only served a third. So he served 30% really and was off 70% of his sentence, which is just beyond me when we're talking about first degree murder charge that potentially can have a death penalty in our state. So it is very weird to me that that's even a thing, that you would serve such little time, and just a sad thing to me that Abe's family had to wait almost 30 years and then this guy gets out after 11 years. So, and to go on to obviously not anything for community, society, or anything, just kind of perpetuating more issues than anything. Bottom line, it's just an absolute travesty. Kind of ending on when Joe, in 2003, Joe was interviewed about his dad's case, and he says to the cameras, when your father is murdered, you have to live with that every day, especially when you haven't found out who murdered your father. So this was Joe talking. And now I will say, at least for Joe's family, in the wake of the horribleness that happened to Joe, at least his family did not have to wait that 25 years for answers about what happened to Joe. That would have just been absolutely devastating. I did get to meet and talk to, not meet in person, but talk to some really wonderful people, and a lot of people messaged or responded and such, and got to talk to Billy, which was amazing, Joe's daughter. But just connect and remember Abe and remember Joe. So two victims that should never have been, just for this simple matter of greed and addiction. So just, these cases are just so sad. This is definitely a sad one, but again, I'm so thankful that Joe's family did not wait 25 years for answers. Thank you guys so much for listening this week, and I appreciate you being patient waiting on this part 2. I've got a lot of content coming your way, and I do say I have a listener story that's I'm putting together that's coming soon to kind of get us in our spooky season, because September we're going to lead into spooky season, and then all of October all the episodes are going to be absolutely spooky, paranormal, whatever, but we're going to have a good time. So I do have room for a couple more paranormal stories. So if you have a paranormal happening, definitely message me, reach out. You can email. It's unexplainedamerica2@gmail.com. So give me your fun, quote unquote, fun paranormal story. Thank you guys. Have a great week. Love ya.